You know, usually when you travel abroad for the first time, you kind of brace yourself for culture shock, right?
Absolutely.
You expect, I don't know, the language to be different, the architecture to be much older, maybe the currency takes some getting used to. But for a lot of Americans, the most jarring experience of a European vacation actually happens somewhere completely mundane,
Right.
the grocery store.
Yeah, it is a very specific, almost surreal moment of realization for people.
Welcome to today's deep dive. We are looking at a really fascinating premium script and some accompanying regulatory notes titled The Banned Ingredient Paradox: Why American Food Looks Toxic Abroad. And our mission today is to basically decode this bizarre reality where the exact same food products are engineered completely differently depending on which side of the Atlantic you happen to live on.
Right, because you walk into a supermarket in, say, London or Paris, and at first glance, everything looks incredibly familiar to you.
Yeah, the brands are the same, the logos are identical.
Exactly. You see the same box mac and cheese, the same fruit-flavored candies, the same citrus sodas you grew up with. But
The colors are just slightly muted.
yes, the neon glow is completely missing. And then, you pick up a box, you flip it over to read the ingredients, and the illusion just totally shatters.
It's crazy. The recipe's entirely different. All those, the synthetic dyes you're used to seeing are just gone, replaced by things like beet juice or paprika extract.
Right. And all the chemical preservatives are swapped out too. And I mean, we aren't just talking about a minor tweak in regional flavor profiles here.
No, not at all.
We are looking at a scenario where the exact same multinational corporation selling the exact same human species under the exact same biological realities somehow operates under a completely different set of moral and scientific rules depending on geography.
It makes you stop and really ask how this double standard even exists in the first place. Like, to understand why a global food giant completely alters its chemical footprint at the border, we really have to look at the foundational legal philosophies that govern our grocery aisles.
Right.
So let's start with Europe, because their approach to food safety seems to come from just a totally different baseline.
It really does. So the European Union basically operates under this framework known as the precautionary principle.
Right.
And in the simplest terms, their regulatory system looks at a new chemical additive and demands, can you prove this is safe enough to belong in the food supply?
So the burden of proof is heavily on the manufacturer.
Exactly, before the
Yeah.
product ever even hits the shelf.
So if a company invents like a new blue dye that makes a sports drink look like, I don't know, radioactive ice or something, they have to run the clinical trials themselves.
Yeah, they have to hand over all the data, proving it doesn't cause harm. And crucially, if there is scientific uncertainty if regulators just don't have all the long-term data yet, but there are reasonable grounds for concern based on, say, early animal studies.
They can actually do something about it.
Yes, the European regulators have the legal authority to just act. They do not have to wait for absolute, undeniable proof of harm to be published in, 50 medical journals before they pump the brakes.
Protection comes first, proof can follow later.
Exactly. Under this philosophy, the consumer's body is basically treated as a protected territory.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the contrast with the United States is just jarring to me.
It really is.
I always just assumed that if a product was sitting on an American supermarket shelf, someone at the FDA had comprehensively tested every single ingredient on the back of the box and just stamped it as safe.
Yeah, that is a very common but very flawed assumption that the American consumer operates under.
Right. But the American market-based model flips that European script entirely. The US system essentially asks, can anyone prove this is dangerous enough to remove?
Right. People view the government as this helicopter parent, carefully screening every single bite of food. But the reality is that the burden of proof in the American system almost entirely falls on the public.
Wow.
Yeah, it falls on public health advocates well after exposure has already become completely normalized across millions of people.
Trying to wrap my head around this, it almost feels like comparing two completely different security systems. Like, the European regulatory model is acting like a strict nightclub bouncer.
Oh, I like that. Yeah.
Right. You do not get through the door unless you're on the list,
Yeah.
your ID is heavily scrutinized, and you are definitively proven to be a safe element.
Right. It's a very high barrier to entry based entirely on prevention.
But the American system, it operates much more like a courtroom. The chemical additive is just presumed innocent. It gets to walk right past the bouncer. It gets to roam around the dance floor. And it can only be kicked out of the club if someone basically proves beyond a reasonable doubt that it committed a crime while it was inside.
Which, as you can imagine, requires building an absolutely airtight case.
Yeah.
The state isn't a bouncer pre-screening the guest list. It's a judge waiting for a prosecuting attorney to gather enough epidemiological data to prove real harm.
And gathering that kind of undeniable proof regarding human biology takes what, years?
Years, often decades.
Decades, which naturally leads to the question of how the American food system became this massive permissive courtroom in the first place. I mean, nobody voted to be a guinea pig.
Right, no one asked for that.
It turns out this entire dynamic stems from a regulatory rule that was completely well-intentioned back in the day, but has just mutated into a massive structural loophole. It's an acronym called GRAS.
Yeah, so GRAS stands for Generally Recognized as Safe. And to understand how it became a loophole, you really have to look at the original intent. Decades ago, regulators realized they were going to be completely bogged down in endless, absurd bureaucracy if they had to run massive clinical trials on basic historical ingredients.
Which makes sense. I mean, the FDA shouldn't have to spend millions of taxpayer dollars verifying that table salt is safe, right?
Exactly. Salt, white vinegar, baking soda, we know they aren't toxic.
Right. Humans have been eating black pepper for centuries. We don't need a double-blind rat study to tell us it's fine.
Right. But over the years, the interpretation of GRAS fundamentally shifted. It really morphed from a common sense protection for salt and vinegar into this sort of soft opening for modern industrial food chemistry.
How so?
Well, under the current mechanics of the system, a chemical company can basically invent a novel synthetic additive, declare it safe for its quote-unquote intended use by marshaling their own experts, and they can bypass the formal FDA pre-market approval process entirely.
Wait. How does a company just declare its own chemical safe? Who is checking their work before it goes into a mass-produced snack cake?
This is the mechanism that surprises most people. The company can literally convene its own panel of experts to review their own internal data.
You're kidding.
No. And if that privately funded panel concludes the chemical is generally recognized as safe, the company could just start putting it in food. It skips the public drama entirely. It is largely a voluntary honor system.
That is wild. In many cases, I read that the FDA isn't even formally notified until after the ingredient is already circulating in the food supply.
That happens all the time.
But playing devil's advocate here, that sounds like a recipe for blatant corruption. Why would a company actively choose to put a controversial chemical in our food? Like, are executives just sitting in dark boardrooms knowingly green-lighting toxic chemicals to save a few pennies?
If we connect this to the bigger picture,
Mm.
we see it isn't cartoon villainy. It really isn't. It is simply the terrifyingly efficient nature of capitalism.
Right.
Corporations prioritize these cheaper synthetic chemical formulas for the American market because they solve very specific, highly technical logistical problems that natural ingredients just cannot solve.
Problems like shelf life and aesthetics, right?
Exactly. Think about the supply chain of a mass-produced pastry. A natural preservative might keep it fresh for, say, 3 weeks. But a synthetic chemical preservative cleared under GRAS, that might extend the shelf life to 6 or 8 months.
Which completely changes the game for shipping.
It drastically reduces shipping costs, warehousing bottlenecks, and food waste. Or consider, an emulsifier that keeps a salad dressing perfectly homogenized on the shelf for a year so the oil and water never separate.
Or a whitening agent that makes a powdered donut look impossibly pristinely white under those harsh fluorescent grocery store lights.
Right. And once these synthetic chemicals are embedded in the factory machinery and the long-term supplier contracts, and most importantly, the profit margins, they stop being abstract molecules.
They become structural.
Exactly. They become the foundational financial infrastructure of the product. Removing them isn't a simple health decision for the company anymore. It becomes a massive economic disruption to their quarterly earnings.
So, since we know companies are basically just following these market incentives, what happens when a single multinational brand is forced to operate under both the European bouncer system and the American courtroom system at the same exact time?
That creates what the source notes refer to as a moral geography, the banned ingredient paradox.
Right. Where the physical ingredient list basically becomes a map of political power and regulatory leverage. And the way the European Union handles artificial colors is a perfect case study of this double standard in action.
It really is. So in the EU and the UK, there are certain synthetic food colors that are technically allowed, but they trigger a mandatory requirement.
The warning labels.
Yes, if a manufacturer chooses to use them, they have to print a stark, unavoidable warning label right on the packaging.
Sure.
And the label explicitly states that the color may have an adverse effect on activity and attention in children.
Oh, wow. Trying to visualize the psychological impact of that in a retail environment. Like, no brand wants its packaging to whisper doubt from the grocery store shelf.
Exactly. Imagine a parent reaching for a cheerful, brightly colored box of cereal with a fun cartoon mascot, only to find a sentence that reads like a medical liability waiver.
It's a total market death sentence.
It alters the economic calculus instantly. So the companies reformulate. And they don't do it because they had some sudden wave of moral clarity. They do it because the regulation made the cost of ignoring the problem too high.
Right. It suddenly became more profitable to use a natural alternative, like
Mhm.
beet juice, than to keep the synthetic dye and lose market share.
But without that mandatory warning label in the United States, the incentives run in the exact opposite direction.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because the psychology of food marketing in the US relies entirely on visual cues. Like in the American supermarket, color is literally money.
Oh, yeah.
It functions as behavioral architecture. These bright, electric, hypersaturated colors are engineered to bypass logic and just transform cheap processed calories into visceral childhood desire.
It trains the brain's expectations before the food even reaches the palate.
Exactly. You don't actually need expensive, perishable, real strawberries in a strawberry-flavored candy if you have a cheap, petroleum-derived red dye that can perform the emotional labor of making the brain feel like it's eating a strawberry.
Right. And synthetic yellow never fades. It never looks slightly brown, depending on the agricultural season. It is aggressively, permanently yellow.
You're substituting complex agricultural reality for cheap chemical certainty.
Yes.
But if the American system relies on this courtroom model, where you have to definitively prove harm to get these behavioral architecture chemicals removed, what does that slow, burdensome process actually look like?
Well, looking at the historical timelines, it is an exercise in slow-motion absurdity.
Right.
It really exposes the fatal flaw of a system that demands perfect proof before taking precautionary action. And the history of FD&C Red Number 3 is arguably the clearest example of this systemic delay.
Let's trace that timeline, because red number 3 is a synthetic dye, and for decades it occupied this completely contradictory, bizarre position in American law.
It did.
It was officially restricted from being used in cosmetics and externally applied drugs, like you could not legally put it on your skin.
Right. The FDA recognized the risk of dermal absorption.
So it's banned from your skin as a blush, yet completely allowed to be put into your food, baked into a cake, and fed directly to a toddler.
Yeah, it makes absolutely no sense logically.
And it took until a specific FDA decision slated for 2025 to formally revoke its authorization in food. And that revocation was tied to a very specific legal mechanism called the Delaney Clause, right?
Yes, the Delaney Clause is a critical piece of 1958 legislation. It basically states that the FDA cannot approve any food additive that is found to induce cancer when ingested by humans or animals.
So the legal trigger was finally pulled because studies showed red number 3 caused thyroid tumors in male laboratory rats. The data was there. But because of the bureaucratic hurdles and the courtroom dynamic,
This took decades.
decades of regulatory friction to bridge the gap between knowing it caused tumors in animals and actually banning it from the American food supply.
And this highlights the broader public health lesson of the courtroom model. Like, a chemical can become culturally normal long after the scientific clouds have gathered over it.
Right.
Generations of Americans consumed red number 3 as a totally normal part of childhood celebrations, while the system slowly gathered enough momentum to complete the act of removal.
And it isn't just an issue with synthetic dyes either. Look at the whitening agent, titanium dioxide, which is known as E171 in Europe.
Yeah, the contrast here is fascinating from a toxicological standpoint. In the EU, food-grade titanium dioxide was stripped of its safety status because regulators could not exclude concerns regarding genotoxicity.
Genotoxicity, meaning the potential to cause direct damage to your genetic material, to your DNA. But, and maybe this is a dumb question, how does a whitening agent even interact with DNA?
Well, titanium dioxide in food often contains nanoparticles,
Okay.
and these particles are so microscopically small that they can actually pass through the intestinal wall, enter the bloodstream, and accumulate in organs. Yeah, so European regulators looked at data suggesting these nanoparticles could potentially cause DNA strand breaks. And applying their precautionary principle, they concluded We cannot definitively prove this does not damage DNA over a lifetime of accumulation, so we are removing it.
Meanwhile, in the United States, titanium dioxide continues to be permitted under specified limits, while safety reviews proceed at just a glacial pace.
Exactly.
It's absurd. The molecule doesn't acquire a passport when it crosses the ocean, it just acquires a regulatory interpretation. The chemical structure is identical, but the legal threshold for danger is just miles apart.
And we see the exact same pattern with BVO, brominated vegetable oil.
Oh, right.
BVO was used for years in citrus-flavored sodas and sports drinks, and its purpose was purely technical liquid dynamics.
How so?
Well, citrus flavoring oils naturally want to separate and float to the top of a watery beverage, but BVO is incredibly dense, so manufacturers would bond it to the citrus oil to weigh it down, which kept the flavor evenly suspended throughout the bottle.
Right, so it completely solves a physics problem for the manufacturer. But what happens when human beings actually drink it?
That's the issue. Bromine is a halogen, and it has a tendency to accumulate in the body's fatty tissues, the lipids, over long periods of time. And high levels of bromine accumulation have been linked to neurological issues and thyroid disruption.
I read that it was actually patented as a flame retardant before it was a food additive.
It was. And eventually, after long-term public exposure and mounting studies, the FDA did finally revoke its authorization. But what's fascinating here is that the American system basically learns in public.
Right.
It treats scientific uncertainty not as a reason to pause and protect the consumer, but as a shelter for the business to continue operating until the final gavel falls in the regulatory courtroom.
And the burden of this delayed action falls directly on the physical bodies of the consumers. I mean, current additive exposure trends could impact entire generations before any final bans are ever issued. Which really brings us back to the reality of the grocery aisle today. Because this systemic delay, this absolute reliance on the market to sort itself out, it doesn't just affect abstract public health data.
No, it is highly personal.
It fundamentally changes the daily life of you, the listener, trying to navigate a supermarket to feed yourself or your family. It forces everyday people to act as amateur food chemists.
It does. The current American food environment essentially converts citizenship into a state of constant vigilance.
Right. Think about the last time you bought groceries. If you're trying to avoid controversial additives, you can't just be a shopper, you have to be a detective.
You really do.
You have to memorize which synthetic dyes are currently under review, which preservatives have been banned in the UK for genotoxicity, what obscure multi-syllable chemical names actually mean. I mean, you're standing in the cereal aisle cross-referencing regulatory databases on your phone just to buy breakfast for your kids.
And that completely dismantles the concept of personal responsibility, which, is a phrase heavily utilized in American debates over food and public health.
Oh, constantly.
The argument often presented is, well, if you don't like the ingredient list, just make better choices. It is your responsibility as a consumer.
But how can you exercise meaningful personal responsibility when the baseline choice is fundamentally distorted? Like the cheapest, most aggressively marketed, most widely available products are chemically optimized to target biological cravings. The system basically bypasses rational choice entirely.
And that leads to a deeply concerning realization about the sociological impact of all this. There is an inherent class system written directly into the ingredients.
The double standard creates economic inequality.
Exactly. Wealthier consumers can simply buy their way out of the courtroom.
Right.
They have the disposable income to afford the premium, organic, dye-free, minimally processed foods that are formulated much closer to the European precautionary standard.
While lower-income neighborhoods and often public school systems are flooded with the cheaper, ultra-processed, shelf-stable chemical architecture.
Yes, economic reality forces them to consume the very additive that wealthier demographics can just pay a premium to avoid. The burden of navigating this landscape falls hardest on those with the least time to research and the least financial flexibility to opt out.
So what does this all mean? When we look at the bouncer versus the courtroom, the evolution of the GRAS loophole, the European warning labels, the whole genotoxicity of titanium dioxide, what is the ultimate takeaway here?
I think it boils down to a massive American blind spot. The public has confused market permission with moral permission.
Right. Just because a massive multinational corporation is legally allowed to sell something, we cannot assume it has passed a meaningful, independent test of safety or biological wisdom.
Exactly. Legality is not a proxy for safety. A highly profitable chemical additive can be totally legal and completely unnecessary at the exact same time.
If we synthesize the reality of this double standard, we see that the American narrative of freedom, this idea that fewer corporate restrictions are inherently better, it takes on a very dark meaning in the supermarket.
It really does. Fewer restrictions on the manufacturer ultimately mean the corporation is freer than the child consuming the product.
Wow.
It means the chemical company is freer than the parent trying to protect that child. The deepest toxicity isn't actually red number 3 or BVO. The deepest toxicity is a national reflex that just accepts preventable, unnecessary chemical exposure at simply the acceptable cost of doing business.
We have agreed to treat the human body as a post-market testing ground for industrial logistics.
That's exactly what it is.
Which leaves us with one final, deeply provocative question to consider the next time you walk down a grocery aisle. We know the American system relies on proving undeniable harm after a chemical has already been unleashed into our food supply. But consider the reality of the modern diet. It isn't just one chemical in isolation. It is a massive, unprecedented storm of variables. We are consuming thousands of interacting additives, preservatives, and dyes, all mixing together in our biology over an entire lifetime.
Completely uncontrolled experiment.
Exactly. So will we ever actually be able to isolate and perfectly prove the harm of tomorrow's new synthetic chemicals in that kind of noise? Or, by demanding perfect proof in a courtroom of incredibly complex chemistry, has the American system guaranteed that we'll just be permanently flying blind? All right, folks, that's all for today's conversation on the American Blind Spot. Thank you so much for joining us, Jesus. And to everyone watching, don't just accept the story you were given. Question it, look deeper, and pay attention to what sits in the blind spot.
And if this conversation made you think, subscribe to the American Blind Spot for more discussions on the ideas America rarely wants to face. Until next time, ciao.